Hello, and welcome to our next presentation. On behalf of the MIT CDOIQ Virtual Symposium, we'd like to thank all of our sponsors who have continued to support the symposium during this very challenging year. Before we thank our partners, we'd like to ask that sometime during the symposium's breaks that you visit our partners' virtual booths. You can also visit the Content Hub on the MIT CDOIQ website for some great partner resources. We'd like to thank the following partners: Deloitte, Informatica, Privacy Analytics, CDOIQ, Fusion Alliance, KPMG, Sandal Consultants, Tamer, Elation, Ali Data, Big ID, Boomi, Caserta, Citizen, Data Kitchen, Garage, Wakira, Pylog, Click, ThoughtSpot, Eckerson, Global IDs, Snowflake, Starburst. And as I said, please make every effort to visit our partners, use the virtual passport, because without them and our partner support, the symposium could not be held. Thank you.
Hello and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your lunchtime. I certainly did. Got a little bit of a walk around outside. But today, at this hour, we're going to hear from Mark Johnson. He's an executive data leader at Fusion Alliance and is the chairman of the editorial board at CDO Magazine that we heard about on day one. Mark has over extensive experience in strategic and data and enterprise IT leadership. He's a speaker and a consultant with deep and knowledge of all resources. So today, understanding and structuring data governance for success is Mark's topic. Mark, would you like to take over?
Thanks, I will definitely do that. Can everybody see my screen? Let me just make sure I'm sharing.
Yep, you're good, or we're still seeing you.
Okay, hold on one second. I will have that screen up. 1 second. Share. All right, can you see my screen now?
Yes, might want to go into presenter mode.
There we go. All right, well, thanks everybody. This is pretty exciting symposium this year. We're excited. I'm also on the organizing committee for the function. So I want to talk about data governance really in the new world. And as we think about it, I'd like to just take us out to the year 2030. And we talk a lot about the future with our clients. And of course, COVID pandemic has created a number of other imperatives for us to consider. But the world in 2030 is probably going to look more like this Back to the Future picture of the Jetsons. One of the things that wasn't really apparent to us when the Jetsons was a program was the fact that the Jetsons program was really undergirded by data and analytics. And so that's the age we're living in now. And so 10 years from now, what will the future look like? So thinking about 2030, we will certainly see a world that's driven by data and analytics. And the data, the network, cloud and mobile will power life as we know it. Now, as we think about the evolution that we've been in with regard to the use of data and analytics, we sit today in the world of a pandemic that has changed really the landscape of all life. And so being digital and having access to each other digitally and commerce, having access to essential life services, shopping online has become the norm. And so when we think about, for example, the store of the future, we really have to strike the word or the phrase, the future, out and think about life today, the store of today. And that really is an online experience of shopping and conducting learning scenarios through academia at all grade levels, really through the digital channel. And so a number of things are implicated in this kind of new world order we live in. So if we just take kind of, for example, I'm going to use Kroger. Kroger is one of my large clients in Cincinnati. We work closely with Kroger. But you can see here that Amazon's online grocery sales aren't hurting Kroger, according to the analysts. In fact, Kroger's online sales during the first quarter of this year soared to 92%. And actually, year to date now, they're topped 100% for the first 3 weeks in the second quarter. Now, this is an exciting success story. Kroger was going to present at Symposium this year, but things didn't work out as the schedule changed. But it's an exciting success story, and I want to kind of take you back to how it all began. So in October of 2017, Kroger executives made a decision, an important change in thinking ensued there, and it was really the realization that data was going to be the new battleground for the company. In the fall of 2018, Rodney McMullen, Kroger's CEO and chairman, actually redrafted the business strategy for the company and placed data as the #1 business strategy. So Kroger's been making significant investments in data and analytics really since the fall of 2017, and seeing it as a really important set of capabilities to pivot their business for the future. So if you look here, you see a product commonly sold in grocery retail, so a can of corn. And you can see that there's a lot of data on that can of corn if you just look at the label, and really understanding how to market a product as simple as a can of corn, or maybe as complex as a can of corn in a digital landscape really requires a significant amount of data. Kroger back in 2015, 2016 invested in a massive expansion of their item master, which is really critical, anticipating a pivot to large-scale digital commerce, adding a number of data attributes, up over 3,000 data attributes to their item records in their core systems to support everything from merchandising, planogramming for stores, understanding supply chain implications for the product, and also providing customized data and insight to the consumer in a digital shopping experience that would be enriched and really considered to be transforming to a friction-free experience, as Kroger likes to describe it. So their latest announcement actually just came out this week, is that Kroger now has announced plans to go live with a digital marketplace for third-party sellers this fall. So looking at really not only competing with the likes of Amazon, Walmart, Target, and Costco, Kroger is actually planning to drive really hard into online e-commerce in a digital marketplace that brings all a wide variety of other third-party sellers online in the Kroger portal and digital apps. So undergirding all of these capabilities has been the ability to harness, capture, and curate and govern the data that is used to drive Kroger. So as we can see, they entered the pandemic world really well prepared, but that's been a long battle internally for the technologists and the people who had passion around data to actually pivot the ship of Kroger in the direction of the future as a foundation that was set based on data and analytics. So I want to turn this conversation to a very practical discussion. And this is a presentation that's just been sort of evolving over the years. I've delivered it in a number of venues in the past in different forms, but it's really, the purpose of this presentation is to really help everyone really understand how to communicate the importance of organizing around the theme of a chief data officer and empowering that leader as a part of the executive leadership and strategy development capabilities of the organization. And so this deck has actually been consumed and used by a number of organizations that have been on a journey to educate the C-suite. And really the purpose of the CDO magazine, as mentioned earlier, is just that, to help educate the C-suite leaders on the importance of data management and analytics as the world turns increasingly digital. So we have a couple of definitions here. One that I like is that data is limitless and present everywhere in the universe. We see data coming from all kinds of sensor devices today, from social media. We see it coming from our cell phones from a geospatial perspective. Yesterday, I talked about a number of different uses for movement data from a company called SafeGraph. And so there's just a wide variety of data available to empower knowledge and value creation. But also the second definition here is that I think really kind of interesting is that data sits in computers and its symbols and signals that are stored and processed by a computer. And they can either be collected, by endpoints or delivered to endpoints. But data are important building blocks, but in and of themselves, they're challenging to use. So we're going to talk about why it's important. So staying with our grocery store analogy, if you think of going to a grocery store and shopping for canned goods, if what you encountered in the aisles were cans without labels, how comfortable or confident would you be to pick one of those cans up, purchase that, and put that in your shopping cart and purchase it at checkout? Probably not very comfortable at all, because while the content may be fit for consumption, you have absolutely no idea what that can contains. And so when we think about applying labels, then we make the products that are in those cans, we make those accessible and consumable. And so if you think about data in the abstract as product in a can, and if you think about data that isn't governed or stewarded very well, or that there's not the maintenance and curation of technical and business metadata around that data, then it's like looking at this shelf of cans that have no labels. And so when the business is depicted by the arm of the person reaching to pick up a can in the second picture, when the business thinks about what data they should use to fulfill an ingredient in an analysis that they're trying to mount for the organization, it's really difficult to find the right data. But if the data is accurately labeled and curated, then it becomes a lot easier. Now, one of the things to think about is that labels are not, we take labels for granted when we go into the grocery store on all kinds of products, but the fine art of creating a label that informs the consumer about exactly what is inside or behind that can or inside that box or inside that bottle, that fine art is a very well tuned and finely crafted art that has really been perfected to a science over the years, so that labels have standards in the number of calories, for example, the number of grams of sodium or sugar. There are some standards that in the format of that label that all products conform to, and it makes it easy for the consumer to actually consume what's inside that can with confidence. Now, if we think about the knowledge worker in the enterprise context, the knowledge worker is really the data consumer. The knowledge worker is the person who brings the raw material of the data together to create knowledge or insight that can be used to drive a business. And so it is the knowledge worker that we're serving in the whole idea of governance with a purpose. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So the data are an organization's sole depletable or non-depletable, non-degrading durable asset. And this is a quote from a recent work published by Peter Aiken, who you may have encountered around Symposium this year. But what he suggested, it's only through a proficient individual, we would call that person a chief data officer, who's is kind of characterized in three ways: is dedicated, solely to data, and leveraging that data asset, isn't constrained by the sort of project mentality of IT, or really a part of IT in the sense of how we think about IT, and that reports directly to the business. Only really ultimately in that configuration can an organization make full leverage of their data assets. And I believe that to be true as a practitioner. Over the years, I've worked both on the supply, on the sell side, I would say, from a consulting perspective, and on the buy side from the enterprise point of view, driving these disciplines out so that the organization could take advantage of data. And the more responsibility or the more buy-in that the executive leadership team had to the empowerment of leadership responsibility for the management of the data warehouse or the data marketplace or the BI landscape, with an accountability to the business, the greater the return on investment or the impact has been in terms of driving value from the expenditures there. Now, the other thing that I would like to just point out, and I think everybody's probably pretty aware of this, is that data is increasingly mobile. And by that, I mean, if we think about the places that we see people plugged in conducting activities, here's a view of the daily lives that we were serving pre-pandemic, and even more so now. But these are all of the different kinds of categories where mobile apps have become really the way to interact. In fact, I just deposited three checks into an account that I maintain in another state. And I just did that by taking a picture of the checks and, making those deposits happen. So, banking, in a mobile context, not just banking online, has become really kind of a standard. I did some stock trading yesterday morning with my mobile app. So there's a lot of different things we do. Just touch-free payments, which the pandemic has really ushered in a great need for, is now really the sort of the future of payments. No longer do we want to swipe our credit cards. We just want to wave our cell phone near a payment device, and without any touch at all, we want to be able to check out. I work closely with FIS, which is the old WorldPay Vantif organization, another client of ours. And one of the things that they've seen is a real demand push for touchless payments. And so this is really kind of the way of the future. We see, in the media, there's a struggle over the post office. Do we need it? Don't we need it? Does it support, voting? How much of an essential service or platform is it in a world where we do so much of our communicating through electronic platforms and email, for example? So increasingly, the digital space, the mobile space is delivering the mail. And so you can see a number of other things: terrorism, national security, charitable giving, mortgage lending. I mean, today it's possible to go to Rocket Mortgage and do everything to consummate a $500,000 mortgage loan without ever really touching or talking to a human over there. That wasn't the case 5 years ago, but they've been made in significant investments in data curation and integration and digital capability enablement through data to really take all of the friction as much as possible out of the experience of originating a mortgage loan. And so when it's touchless like that, you can take advantage of more customers coming to your front door. But that just doesn't happen organically. So we're going to talk a lot about that. Just another quick example, and this just shows you how much of a dinosaur I really am. My son, who's 26, recently purchased a car last week, actually. And this is his first ride on his own insurance policy off of mine. And so he had to get a new insurance policy. So he asked me where to look, and I told him to use the Zebra, I believe, an app, and search for competitive pricing for the insurance policies, which he did. And he found a good price and everything. And he said, so I'm just going to go ahead and check out now and buy it. And I said, well, no, you can't do that. You have to call the insurance agent. There's a little bit more information they're going to need. I'm not sure that that's a legitimate site if it's asking you to swipe your credit card to buy insurance for an automobile, because I don't think your policy can be bound like that. And he said, no, it looks like pretty straightforward here. It just says if I just put my credit card details in, it has my driver's license number. I put the VIN number of the car that I'm purchasing. It looks like I can just get the insurance policy now. So I said, well, I just wouldn't do that. I'd wait until you go to the insurance dealer, but before then I'd call the agent. He said, okay, Dad. So he hung up the phone and he went the next day and bought his car and called me after he had driven off the lot. And he said, well, I'm really excited. I bought the car. I said, great. Did you call the insurance agent? He said, no, I just swiped my credit card and I got my proof of insurance ID card on the app. And so I showed it to the dealer and everything was fine. And I'm like, wow, well, I learned something from you. We work a lot in the insurance industry. And so I began to sort of wonder which insurance company showed up in his search. So I did some searching myself and noticed some of the reputable national brands didn't show up in the search. Now, I don't know if that's just because they didn't subscribe. This app, purports to be a representative of all of the insurance companies out there, but the number of the nameplate insurance companies just weren't present. And but those that were, you were able to consummate that insurance transaction right online. And I believe those are the companies that are going to be, getting the business of ladies like the one that's in this picture here in Generation X, who are going to be the consumers who dominate society as we go forward. So just some examples there. So the essentials, when we think about data and data governance and managing our data and using it, there's just kind of three big things here that we want to do. First, we want to be able to trust our data. Then we want to be able to supply trusted data to the business. And so we then want to be able to allow the business to consume it. And those are really kind of an abstracted view of the simple equation. And again, thinking about this message going to the C-suite and helping to inform your CEO or your CFO or your CMO or whomever may be there, chief risk, privacy officer, et cetera. Thinking about educating them, you could use an abstracted message. Keeping it simple is the best way to communicate. So again, that's the idea of this presentation, to be rich but easy to grasp for the unindoctrinated. So enabling the essentials requires governance, and that's really what I want to talk to everyone about, this in this session. For the balance of the time that I have for this session, and then we'll open up for some questions and answers. So continuing with this idea of some simple definitions here, we have what is governance. So it's the organized insight and management, or the stewardship of essential services necessary to ensure that those services meet the needs of and enable a positive experience for our stakeholders, or those would be residents or businesses or whatever the case may be, if we just think in an abstracted way. Governance requires a governor. So, and that's the highest ranking executive responsible for orchestrating the delivery of essential services required to ensure a positive experience for our stakeholders. Those are the people that we serve. In the organization context, could be our customers, our employees, our shareholders, our board of directors, et cetera. And why is governance necessary? Well, it's necessary to avoid chaos. So remember, think about what would happen, the chaos that would ensue if all of a sudden you went to Kroger and all of the products on the shelves had no labels. So everybody would be sort of fighting and asking each other, well, where is the canned corn, or where is the Campbell's soup, or which of these boxes contains Chex, or or Captain Crunch, if there were no labels and pictures that were communicative, no metadata, if you will, no descriptive information about what's inside those packages. So it's necessary to avoid chaos and to provide, the essential services that are necessary for peaceful living and business conduct and commerce in order to ensure a positive experience for our stakeholders. But this is really the key. If I were underscoring something, it would be this positive experience for our stakeholders. Positive experience for our stakeholders, positive experience for our stakeholders. So within the organizational context, governance is really all about helping our stakeholders have a positive experience with the information they need to run the organization better. We see in the news every day another university is reverting from in-person on-campus learning to online academics because of some of the behaviors and the inability to sort of track the data when these cases are outbreaking. And so you can imagine that the university IT department is being pressured heavily to be able to organize these contact details around the student population and how they're moving around on campus in order to ensure this experience, but it doesn't seem to be going extremely well so far. So I want to give you a metaphor that might be helpful in the organizational context. And I say might be helpful, but I'm really kind of setting you up. I'm kind of telling a lie here. I know this is a very helpful metaphor because every time we've used it over the years that I've referred to this, people tend to get it in the C-suite. And that is the metaphor that the CFO is actually a chief data officer. And by that, what I mean is, if you think about the data set that the CFO is responsible for, it's the financial data set for the company. So that is a data set, represents the physical and liquid assets and hard assets of the organization, and how those assets are moved around and valued and classified. And all of the disciplines that follow generally accepted accounting principles, GAAP, that are overseen by the finance subcommittee of the board of directors and the executive team, who are following policies, standards, and procedures that the CEO has signed off on as to how the organization is going to treat, manage, and interpret its financial data. It is really a very good metaphor for thinking about how the organization should treat and manage some of the other data that's as important to the organization as the finance data is. But one thing that you probably would agree with me on is that in most organizations, we trust the financial reports. And the financial reports are aggregations of financial data that, whether it's coming from our sales systems and it's, transactional information that's been aggregated up at the product level, by customer segments, et cetera, but it's the financial data that represents sales, or it's payroll data, or it's receivables data, or it's payables data, or it's expense information, or it's the valuations of our fixed assets that have been, depreciated over time. That when all of that data aggregates itself together, we, number one, trust it. We, number two, can supply it. And we, number three, can consume it. And we can consume it in a way that is so profoundly interesting that the CEO can take the signature of the CFO certifying the financial statements and release that information to the streets, to the shareholders, make financial reports quarterly, publish that data to the federal government in the form of 10Qs and 10K filings, use it for tax returns, et cetera. So when you think about the CFO's organization, that person, he or she, doesn't accomplish all that work by themselves. They have a team, and that team is represented by some, sort of senior data stewards, if you will. The person who's responsible for overseeing the treasury data set, person who's responsible for overseeing the tax data set, the person who's responsible for overseeing the accounting side, and then the finance side. And so you can see these would be like what we would call data stewards. And this would be like the data owner, or the CFO would be like the chief data officer focused on the finance data. And then these people down in these other little subdivisions that are under treasury, or under these subdivisions that are under tax, or under these subdivisions that are under accounting, or under these subdivisions that are under finance, these people would be subject matter experts. We talk about them in data governance and data stewardship, and they would be members of what we call the data community. So there's a data community around treasury, there's a data community around tax, there's a data community around accounting, et cetera. And the data community is led by the chief data steward for that community. And there's somebody responsible for owning, that finance data set, which we would call the CDO. In this case, it's the CFO. So you kind of get the idea. Well, if you can wrap your head around this model, and how this model and these collaborations cause the quality and trustability and the supplyability of the finance data for the organization to be, top notch, then it's not a big leap to take this kind of thinking over and have a conversation about the customer data. So now if we think about the customer data set, there is nobody in charge like the CFO is in charge of the finance data of the customer data. It's a free-for-all. It's a power struggle. It's based on the IT systems, and IT usually carries responsibility and the blame for the fact that we can't count up all of our customers. Or when we think about sort of the facilities organization that manages all the fixed building locations that we operate in, that data set isn't curated with the same kind of diligence that the CFO curates the finance data set with. Now, let me give you another great case analogy here. And this one I'm going to use a large company that I'm aware of. And it could be any large company. So, the name is irrelevant. The industry is irrelevant. But COVID hits and all of its employees run home around the globe. Literally around the globe, their employees have to go home. Now they're beginning to put strategies in place for how they're going to better manage their workforce, their human capital asset. They're going to manage that workforce both into the pandemic, in the pandemic, or through the pandemic, and return that workforce to work. And certainly those policies now that have to be put together in the HR and the facilities organization collaboration will depend on an important set of information, right? And a couple of important sets of information. One is the employee census information by function, et cetera. And the other is the physical location or the facilities information for the manufacturing or distribution or administrative offices of the organization. A simple question to ask then is that the CEO in this particular company asked, which is, how many locations do we have? Now, I know that if you could have an audible microphone right now, you would all be laughing and you would be saying, I'm not sure we could tell you. And that's the case in point of this organization. Well, at that point in time, it became painfully clear why it would be important to have a data governance process focus with some level of generally accepted data management principles on managing a supplier data set or a facilities data set or a employees data set. It became painfully and obviously apparent to the senior executive leadership in this particular company that there was a problem in managing data, and now they're all about figuring out how do we get our arms around being able to just know how many places we actually send employees to work in every day. And those would be the number of places that we would have to then go and understand how we're going to manage the entrances and the exits, and what are the placards and policies that have to be established, and how are we going to do contact tracing of our employee workforce when they're in those facilities, et cetera, et cetera. So COVID has forced this onto center stage, and large employers around the globe are grappling with this issue that they can't just simply get a report they can trust to answer questions as simple as how many physical addresses do we send employees to work at, and which employees work in those physical addresses. So using this metaphor would be helpful. But here's another, and I actually like this metaphor a little better because while it's a different topic, it kind of reinforces the first one in a way that really, provides a level of sort of, oh, wow, I get it, sort of experience for the person who gets it. So you can't answer, so I'll just ask the question and answer it for you. But what is this? Of course, it's a map of the United States, and each one of the states has been nicely labeled. So we know Oregon, then we have Idaho, then we have Wyoming and Nebraska and Kansas and Colorado and Utah, et cetera, et cetera. Ohio, one of my favorite states, that's where I was born and raised, bordered by, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Indiana, and Kentucky, and West Virginia. So, we kind of generally over the years, because we learn about this nomenclature of how the states fit together, if not how they got their shapes. That's, by the way, a great other thing to go investigate when you're just looking for how to burn some time when you're stuck in your home in isolation. Go Google how the states got their shapes. Actually, on Netflix, there's a great show that will tell you about sort of how the states got their shapes. But anyway, we kind of generally know, after years of learning about the 50 states in the United States, kind of roughly where they are and which ones border which ones. So we have some innate knowledge about the data that describes the United States, and that's what I'm saying there. And so welcome to the wonderful and great state of Ohio. Now, when we talk a little bit more about how these states are connected, I want you to think of the states, for example, as subjects of data. So Ohio could represent customer data, and California could represent product data, and Nevada could represent facilities data. So these are subjects of data. Minnesota could represent financial data. So you get the idea. And so product data might be represented by the great state of Nebraska. Anyway, each state is a subject of data, but in order to make the data sort of accessible and relatable, we have to connect it together. So we have to connect together the United States, and the way that we've chosen to connect the United States together is through something we call the interstate highway system. The interstate, not intrastate, but interstate highway system. And so somebody sat down with a pen and a piece of paper and a map of the United States, and they drew out this design they architected the design accommodating some of the physical, topographical obstacles and barriers. They architected this design of a roughly north and south, east and west interstate highway system to connect the states of the United States together, to get you from north to south and to get you from east to west. And so that design has gone extremely well, and it stood the test of time, and you kind of learn it. And so there's a couple of things that if you're not, we take for granted, but most people don't really understand this, but I did teach this to my children in homeschooling, so they know. But there's kind of an intentional design in the way these highways are numbered. And I'm just going to give you a moment to think about what that is while I take a sip of water. Okay, so I have my sip of water. So if you look at the interstate highway system, what you'll notice is that if we go from the bottom to the top, and we go from left to right, going from the bottom to the top and left to right. So the horizontal highways that go east to west, they're all numbered in even numbers, and they go from the lowest even number, Highway 10, which is the southernmost interstate highway, up to Highway 20, up to Highway, we have a Highway 40 here. Then we have Interstate 80, and we have 90, and we have 94. But then even numbered interstate highways go east and west, which means, drum roll, that the odd number interstate highways go north and south. So 15, 25, 35, 55, 65, 75, 81, 95, those highways go north and south. So if you want to tell somebody who's thinking about moving or going from Ohio to California, then they probably would want to take an even numbered highway, and maybe they take Interstate 70 or Interstate 80 and make that trip. So you get the idea here. So there's some predictability and innate design, intelligent design built into how these highways are operating. So if I told you I was going to take Highway 10, you wouldn't think that I was going from New York to LA, because Highway 10 is down south. You might think I'm going from Florida to Houston or something like that. And so anyway, this structure now we can depend on because we understand it. Everybody's been educated to the structure. And this is a kind of a slowly changing dimension. Every now and then we'll add an interstate highway, but for the most part, the once they're defined, they're defined. And so they don't change. Well, guess what? The same is true of your data. Once you set out your subject areas of your data and you organize the relationships between those subject areas, which is what the interstate highways represent, are the connected relationships between the subjects of data. If the states were subjects of data, the interstate highways would be the connectivity between them. But once you define that, it doesn't. And I've been at this for a long time, so I know I've managed hundreds of millions of dollars of IT budget over my career in different functions that I've run. And I've also managed, maybe tens of thousands of data over functions that I've run. And I'm going to ask you to guess which functions were worth tens of thousands of dollars that I ran, and which functions were worth, hundreds of millions of dollars that I ran. So the network, data centers, infrastructure, servers, and storage infrastructure of companies that I've run global IT infrastructure for. Okay, that's one category. And then I've run enterprise data warehousing and BI and analytics. And I've been responsible for data management. So which one do you think has had, hundreds of millions of dollars, and which one do you think has had like tens of thousands of dollars, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars allocated from a budgetary perspective? Okay, you got the answer right. It's the big expenditure is on the physical stuff that we throw away, by the way. And the hundreds of thousands of dollars have been expended on things that are the most durable and non-depletable assets in the entire IT equation. That's right. The data contents, the structure of that data, the definition of that data, the capture of the relationships. Once you spend money and invest in actually curating that landscape, those things don't really change. Like a customer has had a relationship to a order, which has had a relationship to an order line, which has had a relationship to a product on that order line since the very first customer was identified by Aristotle. Those relationships they're non-perishing relationships. There may be more or less attribution added over time, but we spend very little time and effort defining and designing, like this interstate highway system, our data. And so here's an example way to communicate the problems that ensue when you don't do that, is that you have this chaos, right? It's not fit for consumption and use for the happiness of your stakeholders. And so the corollary to that is to have some rational organization of your data. I call it the United States of data, like we have the organization of the states in the United States, and then some articulation of the relationships between, like the interstate highway system would overlay. So if we think of, like, location data, physical locations, boy, wouldn't that that company that I was telling you about earlier be very happy if they had a very well curated and stewarded locations data set. Customer data, offers, channels, products, subscriptions. So you can see some things in here: partners, network, etc. That might be some of the subject areas that would have to be owned in the enterprise. Somebody responsible for, like the controller, the CFO is for the financial data, and then stewarded with a data community cross-functionally, like the folks that we saw on that org chart earlier. So now, if that weren't enough, the data that lives in the enterprise is complemented by the rest of the world of data. And the rest of the world of data is huge, as we all know. It comes from everywhere. It comes from social media. It comes from like the SafeGraph data, which is, now we have a places data set with unique place IDs coming in October to include anonymized movement data that's available from apps installed on cell phones with opt-in for the GPS tracking, so we can see how people are moving around. We have that data set. There's a great presentation yesterday at 2 o'clock from Paul at the weather channel, not the weather channel, IBM's weather organization now, on the weather data that's now available. Is a great presentation. I think it's tomorrow from GE Aviation that is going to talk about how GE Aviation consumes weather data and building digital twins that they can use to analyze the wear and tear on jet engines to make their jet engines some of the most reliable jet engines in the entire world for moving things around in the skies. And so there's all this other sensor data, that we have available that now we all want to integrate with our internal data to inform how we live and operate successfully in a digital world that we have been pushed off of a cliff into with the COVID-19 pandemic. We were thinking that the decade of the 20s would be the decade of the realization of digital transformation, so that by the time we got to 2030, things would look different. But the pandemic has accelerated all of that, as we all well know, because we're all sitting at home attending a global symposium at MIT virtually. And so we are figuring out how to live in a world where the data, the network, and our digital channels are the way that we're going to live. So now we have all of this content, and we call that sort of this big data landscape that is now coming at us, and it's living in the cloud. We'll be talking about that a little bit. So as I mentioned earlier on the preceding slide, we've got these new, very interesting sources of data that are, now informing a better way to understand how things work in the world and how our organizations or our public entities can optimize the experience, the social order, and the quality of life for people who live increasingly in a digital bubble. So now let's think in terms of the data landscape itself and sort of, introduce the cloud here. So we know that now the world is really migrating to the cloud. I was involved in a CDO roundtable forum in a group that has stood up itself this year up in Columbus, Ohio, with all of the nameplates like you might expect nationwide, Grange Insurance, Huntington Bank, all of the big names in the Columbus, Ohio metro. Their data leaders coming together, and they were talking about the cloud and their migrations to the cloud, and what parts of the application portfolio and analytics landscape were heading to the cloud, and how has that been accelerated by the pandemic, and what does that all mean, and how do we govern data assets in the cloud, and how do we ensure data quality, and with this world landscape of data migrating and morphing, sort of daily new sources and new analyses that our organizations need to figure out how to manage effectively and grow the business through a pandemic, et cetera. The data landscape is just very interesting. So, while we'd like to say that the mainframe is dead, we know that it isn't. I'm a mainframer. So there's still the mainframe powering all kinds of really important things like, transaction processing in the credit card industry, or in the banking business, or demand deposit accounts, etc., or just a lot of different applications. So there's data that's still relevant in that world of open systems that are relational, in-tier architected systems that live in a mobile or web context. And then there's the whole world of the cloud, new systems that are being put up in the cloud. They've never lived in an enterprise data center to speak of. And so there's data landing in all of these places. And then there is sort of this big confluence of it all together into something called the modern data platform. I'm just going to stay in abstract terms because, again, we're speaking to the unindoctrinated, non-technical C-suite leader with this message. But there are things we want to do with all of that data. We want to do data mining with statistical tools and languages, and that would support things like data science and advanced analytics and machine learning. They know enough to know that machine learning is something we should be doing. And there's traditional reporting and BI and self-service capabilities that a traditional sort of relational data warehouse might support. And we know that when we look at this sort of modern data platform, that we've got to pull some of the content out, curate it, transform it, et cetera, and provide stewardship and governance and quality assurance capabilities on it so that it can be the gold standard that can be trusted for producing, financial statement quality truth in the organization, if you will. But yet over here, from a data mining, and statistical perspective, we don't really need all that rigor and discipline necessary on the data. We can put it into, some data science scenarios and find patterns without having to have expended all of the time and effort of governance that needs to go into, the gold standard. And so sometimes when we think about data governance, what we're really saying to the organization is we want to understand our data, where it lives, et cetera. We want to get kind of our arms around it. And then we want to really look at those parts of our data that we really have to trust with the utmost integrity as gold standards. And we want to make sure that we're applying the right disciplines, like the finance guy does to the financial data set, the CFO as CDO to the finance data set, so that we can produce financial statements and trust them. Or we could go into a meeting and really talk about how many new customers did we acquire last month and really have an accurate count, or how many new policies of auto policies did we put in place, or life policies, or how many new annuities did we open, what's the growth in annuities, what is the age range. So you got to have some trust in those data sets to be able to get non-arguable numbers reported in the metrics. So I want to talk a little bit now about the best practice governance model, and that's really organizing the data governor's office. So the office of the chief data officer, enterprise data and analytics. So we see there's a governance arm of that, which is really focused and should be on making sure that the data is ready to produce information. And that means we have quality as well. So policy, standards, and procedures and all that lives here. We have an analytics arm. I'm not going to talk a lot about that because this is a data governance discussion and I want to get to the Q&A. And then we have data services. So there's architecture around the data, structuring it. There's developing the data assets and deploying those. And then there's operations to manage and curate the movement of that data, the backup and the recovery of the data. So this is really, when we're thinking about sort of where the CDO's world is headed, and in those organizations that have really amalgamated to the level of accountability around the whole data value stream, where you're going to find these kinds of disciplines really as a part of that organization. And as we think about it in terms of kind of the governance model itself, when you sort of drill into governance, what you're going to find is that, like that CDO, that CFO is the CDO for the finance data, you need a CDO for the other really critical sets of data. In most organizations, that would be your customer or policyholder data, or your patient data, and if you're in healthcare, and then your product side, so your product data, you would want that data to fall under the same kind of rigor to be in there. You probably would want your supplier data as another subject area of data, and then certainly physical assets, your facilities information and your human capital. So those are sort of 5 really common data sets that create skirmishes in the enterprise when we're trying to reconcile report count and and see into our performance around those particular assets that we maintain within our ecosystem to create value for the shareholders. And so the governor, of course, is the CDO. You would have those lead data stewards who sort of look like those folks reporting to the CFO by subject area. And I just gave you the 5. They would have a core team and a data community, which is the data communities would be configured of folks that sit out in the business who touch the systems and operate with those data sets within the operations of the organization. And they are the folks that are those subject matter experts. And then there's those knowledge workers, the folks who are consuming, and those consumers could be, they could be customers. Consumers could be knowledge workers inside the organization. They could sit in the C-suite. They could be on the front line, but they're all going to take advantage and have some voice and contribution to the quality and the integrity and the availability of the data assets that are being created. We think that governance should be centralized and that stewardship should be federated across the organization. And that data owners, which sit at the executive level, they come together and form this governance council, which should be the oversight body. So think of the governance council as the finance committee of the senior executive team that focuses on the policy standards and procedures and safeguarding of the financial data of the organization. And when you do that, you got it. It works. That model is true. So in summary, as we close the presentation, I just want to share a couple of points that governance in this sort of new world order is really governing in a globalized world. We're not going back. The globalized world of data means we've got data coming from all sources inside and outside, including the exhaust of the movement of the citizens in our country and how they interact with places and how those places interact with us. The weather is an important data set that is a context for it all. So we've got to figure out how we govern or oversee and control the investment of resources to make sure that our organization can take advantage of the data in those ways. As with governance in a globalized world context, the governance model is in a state of flux. And so the cloud is still here because the cloud has changed a lot of the pivot points around how our data is created and where it's consumed and managed. And so we have to make sure that we have an agile process for governing data. The governance model, like our global governance model, must remain agile, like I said, to embrace new constructs required to govern. And this is in an increasingly complex landscape of data. And this means that we have to be open to learning, and we can learn by observing and adapting best practices from the CFO's organization and from global governance theaters to the data governance theater. We can bring those knowledge points in. And then finally, we want to remember that stakeholders are demanding that chaos be avoided, right? I mean, they get frustrated when they can't trust or use the data. I know the case was true when this one organization couldn't say how many facilities it had and how they were going to manage the return to work of their employees. But anyway, this is necessary to maintain the peace and within the organization and the quality of business life conducted in the agility and the competitive position of the business. And then finally, the pandemic has changed everything. And I know that I don't have to hammer that point. We're hearing about the pandemic. At least it gets honorable mention in just about every presentation because it's forced us all to pay attention. But the good news is I think it's giving us the ability to make some investments in knowledge within the C-suite that will help us get through this decade of the 20s to 2030. Really ready for prime time. So I'm just going to end there and open up the floor for questions. I think Elizabeth is out there. If I stop my screen share, I think you get back to me. And if you've gotten back to me there, we'll open it up for questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mark. That was a really wonderful overview of data governance and putting it in context which people have a common understanding. I find that data governance seems to catch people off guard and they reject it as an abstraction and not really understand its place. And your grocery store and your interstate analogy, I think gives an anchor point for people to connect that knowledge to, which of course makes it more memorable.
Yeah, and the whole idea, and this is the premise and the vision behind the CDO magazine, is to get these kinds of analogies and success stories that got built off of them, to get that into a form and shape that can penetrate the C-suite and help educate, so that they understand that these are mission essential disciplines we're talking about, not some latest fad.
Very well put. Now, you talk about educating the C-suite, which of course stakeholders, sponsors and funders and people who have P&L responsibility are critical to the success of any data program. But can you talk a little bit about data literacy further down the food chain, data end users or stewards, that kind of thing? How does that play out?
Well, I like to work with, and I'm glad you mentioned the phrase data literacy. So that's really essential, and that's what we're talking about. But I'm afraid a little bit that data literacy has almost become one of those buzzwords that carries, sort of, it's a word that people glaze over on, right?
Mm.
So data literacy is sort of like quality. And so the analogy that I like to use for that is the turnaround of Ford Motor Company. When they came up with the campaign's slogan back, I think in the 70s or 80s, that quality was job one. So data literacy is like quality, and so the quality methods, the Six Sigma disciplines or Deming's approach to quality, which took root in Ford Motor Company and radically transformed the company. We all know that story if we've been around long enough. It happened in a way that didn't sort of hang on buzzwords that got consumed, chewed up, and spit out, right? So data literacy has to become job one as well. Understanding that everybody's contributing to how we use and understand and treat the quality of our data. It just has to really become a part of the day job, like Ford made quality a part of the day job.
Excellent. You just bringing up Deming and his work, that makes me think of just-in-time training, right? Just-in-time manufacturing. So how do you think just-in-time would translate for data governance and data literacy?
Oh, it's a powerful concept. So, crowdsourcing is the way we do that now. And so if you think about when we think about the landscape, and I put up a slide with that sort of data landscape of all the different places it comes from and how it ends up into a marketplace of data. What we really want to also provide is the capacity or capability for the people who consume the data to contribute to understanding what it means, and to use the crowdsourcing metaphor or the crowdsourcing capability to build the repository of knowledge around that data, which helps us create a landscape for literacy. And then the marketing organization or the PR campaign approach to understanding data is really important. So not just the disciplines that people mount to do the work, but also the ability to publicize that work and the concepts that are coming together through crowdsourcing and making that sort of available across the enterprise is key.
Excellent. Thank you. I was just looking around for more questions as they were coming in. We only have about 2 minutes left, but we're getting a number of people asking about this content that you created for all of us. Two things. One, how do we get a hold of you if we want to learn any more about this, have in the future, have questions, and then a little bit about how this content might be made available is a downloadable form.
Okay, so simple way, I'm with Fusion Alliance. So if you go to fusionalliance.com, you can just put a contact us message in there. That's probably the easiest way than remembering my email address, which is mjohnson@Fusion Alliance. It's just M Johnson, but I'm Mark. And then for access, happy to share the slides with anybody who's interested, or to talk further about how, we might be able to help, with services behind what we do. But yeah, just the easiest way is just to kind of contact me through the website there.
Excellent. Yeah, we really usually don't do commercials like this, but it was a direct question from the audience, and we aim to please our audience and constituents. So happy that you provided those details and offered to provide the deck, because 2 people asked about that.
Yeah, and I think one other thing, Elizabeth, I think this, so Symposium is recorded this year. And I know that after the Symposium is over, for all of the registered members, they'll have access to all of the proceedings. So anything that you saw that you want to, review again, or sit somebody down and review with them, I think you're going to be able to do that. And then there may even be a way for you to subscribe non-attenders to be able to sample content. I can't be certain, and Elizabeth and I both on the organizing committee, and that's evolving, but I think we're planning to offer something like that as well.
That's absolutely right. Okay, so we're at the top of the hour. Mark, thanks again. Extraordinary conversation.
Thank you. And thank you everybody in the audience for attending.